It had never occurred to me that my dad might have had a life before me. Of course, I realized that he must have done something with the first 45 years of his life, but I simply had heard so little from him about what he did. Over the span of my entire childhood, I collected only a small handful of glimpses into his pre-parent life. A memory of a favorite place in New York, a story about a trip he took in college, but never anything more in depth than a snippet here or there. In the spring of my freshman year of high school, he died after a challenging battle with cancer, and it was only in the months following his death that I realized I would never get the chance to hear his stories ever again. I felt like one of the most influential people in my life had been ripped away from me, and now I was on my own to figure out where my place was in the family. Within a few weeks of his death, my grandmother, his mother, died too. I was not particularly close to her, as she had had Alzheimer's since I was young, but nonetheless, this was a second shock wave that hit a family that was already in shambles. After her death, my grandmother's house of more than 50 years had to be sold. In the garage, forgotten by time, sat a 1952 MGTD, a British roadster that hadn't moved since 1984 when my grandfather died. When I heard about this car, I knew I had to attempt a restoration, both to prevent it from being sold off with the rest of the house, and for the crucial fact that this might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to save one of the only existing links I have with my father. I immediately asked my mom if we could ship the car from the house in New Jersey to our home here in Santa Rosa. After much convincing and reassurance that I wouldn't stain the garage floor with oil, she agreed. As a complete rookie in terms of anything mechanical, this project was a huge undertaking for me. I would need to understand the functionality of every part of the car before I could even begin work. Over the first several months, I worked passionately, disassembling, assessing damage, ordering parts, reassembling. It then hit me that I knew even less about my grandfather who originally owned the car than I did about my dad. He had died long before I was born, and I never heard much about him from any of my relatives. I was immediately curious to find out more about his life story, his relationship with my father, and his connection with this car that was now mine. I knew that we had a box of old journals of his sitting in the garage, so I decided to start there. Little did I know that my project was about to transform into something completely unexpected. My father was an analog man. I am his digital son. This was written by my father, describing his dad. But in a lot of ways, I feel like it could have been written by me, describing my dad. I feel as if my dad was an analog man, and I am his digital son. As I read more of my father's writing, I began to uncover a side of him that I never knew while he was alive. The relationship that he had with his father in many ways mirrored the relationship that I had with mine. I spent 3 months reading journals, looking at photos, and trying to figure out who my dad and grandfather were. I uncovered stories and facets of their personalities that I never even knew existed. The fact of the matter was, I still didn't really feel like I had a sense of who they were. I had to talk to someone who knew them best.
Sorry, Snoopy. You can't go with us. Dogs aren't allowed on the school bus. Woof.
traveled to England, where my grandfather was born and had his first family, to talk to his daughter Sally. Surrounded by rolling hills and old cottages, I felt closer to my grandfather than I ever had before.
He was an individual. He was always looking to travel, and the American family always said what was sad about the family life was he'd come back from one of his visits, and within a few weeks he'd be saying, I think I'll be getting ready for the next visit. And they'd got their dad back, but he was already thinking of something else. And that was difficult for them. And I think that's where your father fell out with him a bit. But Dad, you're never here. You're never here for me. You're here, and then you're thinking of something else. He was a traveller. He wanted to see the world. And I think he wanted to have a very full life. There was nothing going to hold him back. It's not, well, I've got married and I've got settled. Settled didn't sort of come into it. I want to go and do.
Sally and I talked for hours and hours. She told me about all the places my grandfather traveled. I learned about his childhood, his time in college at Oxford, and what he was like as a parent. But the stories I heard about my own father were the most valuable.
Abingdon, on the River Thames, the MG car factory. From these drawing boards, over the years, have come one model after another of a world-famous family of sports cars. Right now, the draftsmen are working on a very special job, that of designing the fastest 1.5-litre car in the world. A car tailor-made to fit one of the fastest drivers in the world, Sterling Moss.
In many ways, this car represents my grandfather and the time he lived in. He was a man who loved adventure and the open road. Most of all, this car is, just as my grandfather was, an analog in a digital age. The MGTD was one of the last cars to have a hand crank to start the engine in case the electric starter failed. It doesn't have a heater, a radio, or door locks. What it does have is everything you need to go on an adventure. Verity, noun. A true principle or belief, especially one of fundamental importance. Truth is something that is so hard to find for oneself in our complex digital world. However, working on this car has connected me to the simpler analog life of my father and grandfather.
One, two, three, four.
This project isn't over for me. The MG is close to getting out on the road, and I plan on continuing work on the car until it has been restored at least to the point where I can drive it safely. And as for the research, I've only scratched the surface, and this will be something that I will continue to do for the rest of my life. In 6 months, I will go out in the world on my own, and will have to rely entirely on myself for the first time in my life. It will be a challenging new experience, but this project has helped prepare me in more ways than are even apparent to me now. My father as a writer and photographer, and my grandfather as an engineer, have both inspired me to pursue a career in which I can do both science and art. The knowledge I've acquired over the past year has helped me understand myself better as well as my place in my family. And while I didn't uncover everything I was looking for, the link I share with my father and his father before him is clear to me now. I'd like to dedicate this video to my dad, the greatest photographer I've ever known.